Let's look at some different groups in this period of supposed prosperity. World War I was the peak of a golden age for the American farmers. Europe goes off into war. The boys leave the farms to go fight the war, of course. The armies need to be fed. European land is literally destroyed in many cases. The demand for U.S. agricultural goods goes through the roof. And then as Europe rebuilds, though, as the Europeans manage to start producing agriculture again, the farmers begin to struggle. The loans the farmers had taken out during good times in the 1910s for equipment and more land meant that they were able to increase production. Now, the problem is when everybody's increasing production, the value of the crop just goes down. And so despite all the increased production, there's less profit. And then you get the decline in demand from Europe. And soon the farmers can't make their debt payments. Tens of thousands lose their land. The 1920s is the first time in American history the number of farmers in this country actually goes down. Half in Montana alone lost their land between 1921 and 1925. We think about everything falling apart in 29, but for farmers, this starts earlier. This is also true in mining and lumber for similar reasons. In fact, 3 million Americans leave the rural world to move to the cities. Southern California grows dramatically. Los Angeles jumps from 500,000 to 2.2 million people because of this, where it develops significant oil, automobile, airplane, and film industries, of course. The Great Depression starts early for the rural folks. The industrialization of farms is also growing. The steam tractor and the disc plow, which are both pictured here, are major developments that mean they require less labor and can produce more food, which, as we've said, is actually something of a trap. Farms begin consolidating. As one guy can't pay his debt, businesses come in and scoop up a bunch of farms in an area and create large factory farms that increasingly stop employing the people who've traditionally lived on the rural areas up there, the old farm families, and turn to migrant labor, which is cheaper and easier to control. Technology also leads to significant increases in irrigation, dramatically increasing the acreage farmed in California, Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. Asians, of course, are still banned from migrating to the country because of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, and blacks are unwelcome in the West. It would be a mistake to think the people in the West were somehow not racist towards black people. There just weren't a lot out there, and they didn't want them there. And so, of course, they turned to the migrants who are coming across from Mexico. And Mexican migration has increased significantly in the 19-teens because of the revolution, the civil wars in Mexico. And so that process really gets underway here. Movies convinced the world that the U.S. was a utopia. Ford and Hoover were national heroes. Ford, of course, for successfully buying and selling cars, and Hoover for distributing food during World War I. Artists like Heinz had celebrated factory machines with his photography. Bruce Barton wrote a book called The Man Nobody Knows in 1925, where he presents Jesus as the greatest advertiser of his day, a virile, go-getting He-Man of business, he calls them, who picked 12 men from the bottom ranks and forged a great organization. So here he is taking these religious ideas, Christianity, and recasting it for this consumer society. The veterans of the Committee on Public Information from World War I would become the public relations and advertising men of the 20s. And they worked very hard to change attitude towards corporations and Wall Street. People forgot, for example, that the stock market had been revealed as rigged in the 19-teens, and Americans became increasingly obsessed with the market. And people, even those without a lot of money, began to invest fairly heavily into the stock market. By 1928, 1.5 of 28 million families held stock. Regular people were getting into the stock market. I saw an interview with a wealthy person at the time who said, "I knew we were in trouble when my chauffeur started talking to me about his investments." The labor losses of 1919 crippled the unions. Businesses used the idea that unions were somehow associated with socialist, communist, and anarchist, to push what they called industrial freedom. And they began to prevent their workers from unionizing and making demands. They began to do things like offering pension plans, retirement plans, insurance through their jobs, job security, and safety. They would do things like have company sports leagues. You know, the old, we asked for a raise, we got a party, a pizza party. This was often called welfare capitalism. Business is now talked about the human factor. And all, of course, of this is done to keep the workers from unionizing and the government from regulating. It was also called the American Plan. Businesses claimed collective bargaining was an infringement of personal liberty and a menace to the institutions of a free people, they said. Socialism and unions were always blamed for agitation, never the poor conditions of the workplace. Businesses insisted they had to be free of any rules in order for them to prosper, and they brought in strikebreakers and detectives to break up unions, as well as putting anybody who discussed a union on blacklists so they wouldn't be hired other places. Organized labor lost 2 million members during the time and conceded over and over again. Only the most desperate workers, like Southern textile workers, for example, went on strike, and they had no chance. The public, the government, the politicians, the courts, and of course business, and not to mention the press, were all against them. Minister Reinhold Niebuhr said, "We are rapidly becoming the most conservative nation on earth." The women's movement splintered after suffrage. Black women wanted an end to the poll tax and literacy test. Some even embraced socialism. There were two ideas of women's rights. One as kind of the right to be a mother and live that life. The other as a right to an individual. Alice Paul pushed an equal rights amendment. The 14th Amendment had not specified gender or sex, and she insisted that that had to be added to the Constitution. She wanted equal access to employment, education, and everything else in society. Others feared that laws protecting women and mothers would go away if there was an equal rights amendment. There were, after all, mothers' pensions. The biggest pension in this country until Social Security was the Confederate Widows' Pension, which paid money to the widows of Confederate soldiers. Would that go away if it said men and women had to be treated equally? And many people were dependent on that. All women's organizations, except Alice Paul's National Women's Party, opposed the ERA. And the ERA failed, as did the amendment that was proposed to end child labor. Women failed in politics, but they did not fail in culture. Consumerism liberated some young women. Now, another way the 20s is kind of like our modern times is, the 20s is, from what I can tell, the first time that the culture, the style of the poor becomes a fixation, a fascination with the wealthy. And this, we can first see this really in the flappers. Flappers are young girls from poor families who work in factories. And, they like to go out. They are living in a city, not on a farm, so there's lots of opportunities for them to go out. They wore bob haircuts, as you can see here, because of the factories. Because if you're going to work in a factory all day, it was going to be more comfortable and safer to wear your hair short. This wasn't so much a fashion statement as a reality. And they wore what they considered at the time to be very short skirts that were slightly above the knee, which was scandalous at the time. And they went out and they drank and they smoked cigarettes. The drinking thing is interesting too. This is a direct result of Prohibition, which I'll talk about when I get to Prohibition. And they like to go out and dance. And the popular music at the time, particularly in working class neighborhoods, which were often multiracial, was jazz music, which I'll talk about more later as well. And these girls were often openly promiscuous. They became something of a fixation, first because there was a sexual obsession. I mean, when men get the impression, true or not, that there are women out there who are willing to have sex, it kind of becomes a fixation. Here you see Flapper Magazine, which is a magazine with just pictures of flapper girls. I mean, fully clothed and everything, but they were selling that because of this idea. And then it becomes a fixation with the women who decide to start dressing like them. Corporations, of course, are happy to sell to these young ladies. They're buying makeup, cigarettes, booze. In 1904, a woman had been arrested in New York City. By 1920s, Edward Bernays' ad campaign told women cigarettes were torches of freedom. Unfortunately, though, this freedom ended with marriage. After that, freedom meant being able to buy appliances. I also want to point out Clara Bow here. She's the one with her own picture there, the bigger picture. She was a silent film star. And she's charming. Look up some of her videos on YouTube. She has a magnetic screen presence. And she became kind of the face of flappers. Unfortunately, she was not the voice of Flapper. She had a very strong New York accent and a very nasally voice. And so when sound movies came along, it just didn't translate over very well, and it just ended her career. This is, from what I can tell, basically what Singing on the Rain is based on, although Clara Bow seems to be a nicer person than that lady. Another flapper I want to point to is Dorothy Parker. She was an intellectual. She did not come from a poor factory background. She wrote for the New Yorker, but she liked to go out and party. She lived the flapper lifestyle. And here are some of her great quotes. Beauty is only skin deep, but ugly goes clean to the bone. I like to have a martini, two at the very most. After three, I'm under the table. After four, I'm under my host. And you can see the rest here. I don't have to read the screen to you.